Hello, and welcome back to the Field Notebook. My name is Knox Tabor, the editor, creator, manager, what have you, of this anthropology, classics, and history-based podcast at UTK. I apologize for audio issues in the first episode. I'm still very new to audio production, so please bear with me. This episode, however, should be better. This episode was made by my buddy Finn and his co-host Andy. They are talking about African descendants in Latin America and how it pertains to slavery. I'm really excited to hear what they have to say, and I hope you are too. Any other UT students that have previously recorded podcasts like this one, or have an idea for a podcast or want to use this as an outlet for a final project, please feel free to reach out. I would be more than willing to facilitate and help you bring this idea to life. But without further ado, here is Finn and Andy and their project.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Finn's Epic Historical Fun Experience podcast. Today I have guest Andy with me, and I'm Finn, by the way. Today we're going to be talking about African descendants in Latin America. Specifically, we're going to be talking about fugitive American slaves in Mexico and slaves from Texas. We're going to discuss the institution of slavery in Texas, examine the factors that influenced slaves to flee to Mexico, and take a look at how fugitive slaves fared once they reached the border. So, say hi, Andy.
Hi, what's up? I'm Andy.
All right, let's just get right into it. First, we're going to talk about slavery in Texas. Texas was the last slave state to join the United States of America. Although Texas had one of the shortest stints of slavery in a period of 50 years, from 1815 to 1865, the institution was absolutely vital to the state of Texas.
Wait, hold on. Wasn't Texas originally part of Mexico?
It was, actually. Before Texas was part of the United States of America, it was owned by Spain. And in 1821, it was kind of used by Spain to draw in American immigrants because there weren't a lot of settlers in the Texas area. So Spain kind of made incentives for Americans to move there, which were mainly cheap land. A lot of these Americans brought their slaves with them. That was in 1821, which was right before Spain was overthrown as the colonial kind of ruler of Mexico. After Mexico took over, migration to Texas continued, and it was led by Stephen Austin, who the city of Austin is named after.
Interesting.
By 1827, 12,000 former U.S. citizens lived in Texas, although there was a lot of tension between, obviously, Mexicans and Americans living
I can
in the same
imagine,
state.
yeah.
Kind of compounding that was the fact that Texas was combined with Coahuila, which was majority Mexican, so the white Texans wouldn't really get much representation. In the 1820s and 1830s, the Mexican government had a lot of legislation that was targeted towards Texas slave owners, including the abolition of slavery in 1830. Slavery by that point had been on the decline for a long time in most of Mexico, very clearly to target Texans. Also, the Mexican government changed from more of a states' rights administration to a strong central government, which led to a further decrease in Texan representation in the government.
Yeah, if they were anything like modern Texas, I know they wouldn't be fond of that.
Oh, yeah. But, yeah, so that's where we get the War for Texan Independence. Of course, the Battle of the Alamo. Never forget.
Never.
Interestingly, after the Battle of the Alamo, General Santa Anna, the acting president for Mexico, was captured by Sam Houston, who Houston is named after, the city of Houston. And he forced Santa Anna to sign a treaty that would guarantee Texan independence from Mexico. So Texas became independent, and that was in 1836. So 10 years later, U.S. expansion has turned into the Mexican-American War. The U.S. seized almost half of Mexico's territory, which we know as the Western United States today. But yeah, so it's interesting. Basically Texan independence and the Mexican-American War were kind of fueled by the desire for slavery in Texas. And slavery in Texas isn't really talked about very much in the broader study of slavery. As time went on, defense for slavery in Texas only became stronger up until the Civil War, at which point a lot of Southern politicians were rallying for Texas as this bastion of slavery, with some claiming that it would be the empire state of slavery. This was obviously a couple years before the Civil War. So slavery in Texas was officially abolished at the end of the Civil War in 1865, and news of abolition reached a lot of enslaved individuals on June 19th, inspiring the Juneteenth holiday.
Oh, that's interesting. I always wondered where that came from.
Yeah, it comes from slavery in Texas. Interestingly enough, enslaved communities towards central Texas didn't receive news of abolition until much later, like months after abolition itself. Yeah, essentially, the history of perceptions of Texas from 1815 to 1865 highlight its position in the South as this very slavery-forward state, and it kind of doubled down on that as slavery became threatened.
That makes sense. They were a very agriculturally focused economy.
Oh, yeah.
So, taking it back in time a little bit more, tell me a little about what the actual practice of slavery was like in Texas, and how exactly do we get to Latin America with that?
It's good that you asked that. So slavery in Texas was characterized by harsh conditions. Just like with everywhere else, enslaved people were forced to adapt to life in slavery. They did this through religion, family, and music. Some of them even resisted slavery. There were no organized revolts in Texas that were recorded, but there were a lot of individual acts of violence, especially slaves against slave owners, and a lot of slaves ran away as their form of resistance. And especially in Texas, it was much easier to run to Mexico than it was to go anywhere else. Interestingly, running away was sometimes a temporary solution to problems at the plantation.
Interesting.
It would be to escape some punishment or physical violence. Obviously, enslaved people who actively, violently resisted were somewhat of a minority, as the majority didn't exactly submit to slavery, but kind of tried to find a middle space between submission and resistance.
Right, yeah, like a bargaining tool.
Yeah,
kind of.
they sometimes use that to secure additional rights for themselves or privileges.
Right. So I learned in elementary school that most slaves fled to Canada, but you're telling me right now that a lot of them went to Mexico. Why exactly would a former slave or an escaped slave choose to go to Mexico instead of Canada?
Well, it is true that a lot of fugitive slaves fled north to the northern states, obviously, where slavery was outlawed, or to Canada, where the British Empire had abolished slavery. And a lot of research and popular stories, especially those that we learn about in school, focus on this northward journey. But that was more common for escape from slavery in border states or more northern enslaved states, like Tennessee, for instance. For a lot of slaves in the Deep South and Texas, Mexico was a much better option for just distance.
That makes sense, yeah. Very geographically accessible.
Yeah, definitely. Especially for the northern states of America, tensions surrounding freed African Americans only intensified towards the mid-1800s as the Civil War kind of ramped up. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1794 and 1850 were particular legislation that was targeting fugitive slaves to the northern states. So these laws allowed southern slave catchers to basically go into the northern states and retrieve their slaves. But there wasn't a lot of documentation required for accusations of fugitive slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the times they would just kidnap free African Americans and sell them into slavery. This was basically condoned by the U.S. government.
That's insane.
The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was even more pro-slavery, as it was one of the compromise things towards as the Civil War was heating up. It was the Compromise of 1850 that gave a lot of concessions to the South regarding slavery with the goal of preventing war. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 received a lot of resistance in the North, especially.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah. So living in the North for fugitive slaves or free African Americans in general, you always had to live in fear of being abducted and sold back into slavery.
Yeah, it's risky even for a free state.
Yeah, exactly.
That's messed up.
It is. Also, Canada and the northern states still had legislation that was very much prejudiced towards race.
Right.
Whereas in Mexico, there was less of that.
Oh, interesting.
They actually had a whole racial caste system where race mixing was very common. You have mestizo groups. I'll talk about that in a second. So for slaves of the Deep South, Mexico was an attractive alternative destination due to its abolition of slavery in 1830, obviously, and its lack of institutionalized racism. By the 1820s, African slavery in Mexico was pretty much obsolete as labor was performed by mestizo groups and indigenous people primarily. with African slaves mainly making up like household duties, basically served as domestic servants.
Interesting.
It was more of a status symbol.
Completely different
Yeah,
than
definitely.
here in the United States.
Yeah. But yeah, ever since the establishment of Texas as a slaveholding territory in 1815, slaves escaped across the border. Most of these were Texan slaves, but a lot came from areas in the deep south like Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi. And actually, interestingly, in 1833, Mexico adopted a policy. They refused to extradite slaves to the United States of America, even those who were clear fugitives.
That's impressive for that period of time.
Yeah, it was mainly a result of tensions between the U.S. and Mexico over Texas. Historically, Mexico and the U.S. have not been on the best terms.
Right.
And so Mexico was obviously a threat to slavery in the South, and it's reasonable that slave owners would have talked about Mexico, and slaves would have overheard or learned from other slaves, sometimes even learning from Mexicans who they worked with on plantations about freedom in Mexico.
So what did the process of escaping over the border look like, and how exactly did they go about doing that?
So escaping slavery, going any direction, was always a process that was very difficult. If captured, fugitive slaves did not expect any mercy or any protections from their owners, as they were often killed or tortured pretty bad if they were found.
Right.
It is estimated that 5,000 to 20,000 fugitive slaves escaped slavery over the border from 1820 to 1865. A lot of slaves in the borderlands of Texas found Mexican individuals that would help them cross the Rio Grande, and a lot of them traveled by land or by sea, stowing away on ships in some cases.
Right.
Especially during the Mexican-American War, slaves that accompanied the U.S. military took the opportunity to flee into Mexico, securing their freedom. And especially during the Civil War, slaves found it even more easy to escape. There were more opportunities, at least.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so in order to keep the Confederate economy afloat, you had to use slave labor. And they often sent slaves down to this port in Texas called Port Baghdad, which is on the border of Mexico and Texas. A lot of them were shipping cotton because that was the main export of the Confederacy. There are accounts that I read of slaves pushing cotton bales into the river and simply floating across the Rio Grande.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And in some cases, Mexicans on the Mexican side of the border were helpful, and they left boats for slaves to cross, which is pretty cool.
That's very cool.
During this period, the relationship between African Americans and Mexicans were particularly strengthened by like a mutual hatred of Americans, because they had both suffered, obviously, at the hands of Americans with the Mexican-American War and slavery, obviously, kind of forming a bond between a lot of fugitive slaves and Mexicans in northern Mexico.
So what were the conditions like for these runaway slaves once they actually got to Mexico?
Although a lot of Mexicans supported fugitive slaves crossing the border, as mentioned before, African Americans still found a fragile freedom in the border region of northern Mexico, where most of them stayed, be it for convenience or family ties in America. So obviously the struggles of immigration into a foreign land, a lot of fugitive slaves didn't know Spanish, especially fugitives had few connections in Mexico. They kind of just got there and had to make a living for themselves. Those who learned Spanish, however, were able to experience a lot better social mobility than they would have in America, even in northern states where slavery was abolished. And in a lot of cases, they were able to apply their skills that they learned as slaves to be able to make an honest living in Mexico. A lot of these attempts to start new lives were stifled by the United States. The South kind of rallied for legislation that would make slave hunting in Mexico legal, and even if it was illegal, groups of Texans led incursions into Mexico illegally in order to find runaway slaves. Individuals like Rip Ford pioneered the slave recovery efforts. In some cases, put up large bounties for the return of slaves.
Wow.
The American invasion of Mexico as part of the Mexican-American War also disrupted fugitive slaves' lives. The United States military hunted fugitive slaves sometimes or punished entire communities where fugitive slaves were found. And there was this whole system in Mexico, the Carta system. It was basically a visa. In order to become a citizen of Mexico or a permanent resident, you would have to prove your citizenship in the previous country and pay a small fee. Slaves weren't recognized as U.S. citizens, and in the 1850s, recognition as U.S. citizens was denied even free African Americans. Part of this was to make places like Mexico less desirable, but that didn't really work as the flow of fugitive slaves continued, but it was just harder for them to get citizenship in Mexico.
Right, right.
And to offset this, a lot of fugitive slaves sought involvement in their local communities, showed that they were contributing to the country and deserved to be naturalized. And involvement in local communities also helped to improve relations between African Americans and Mexicans, and the descendants today still have a distinct population, and they're very much a part of Mexican society. Even after slaves were freed in America, black migration to Mexico was not halted. The policies of the entire United States after emancipation continued to subjugate black people.
Right. Yeah.
And create an environment in which they found it hard to find social mobility.
And Mexico is a lot more accepting to African Americans.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, there was the whole Jim Crow, obviously, and like lynching and legal segregation in the South. And in some cases, former fugitive slaves came back to the U.S. after emancipation. They found a country that was actively contributing to their suffering, and the part of the country that wasn't was ambivalent to their suffering.
Right. Very large part of that problem still remains.
Oh, yeah. Racial discrimination still very much alive and well in America. So do you have any other questions before we kind of finish up here?
Yeah, you mentioned that the Mexican-American War was fought in a large part due to slavery in Texas. That was a large part of it. Did the freed slave, escaped slave population in Mexico and Texas play any important role in that?
They actually did. During the Mexican-American War and the Texan War for Independence, a lot of fugitive slaves actually were enlisted in the Mexican army and fought alongside Mexicans against Americans.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's very cool.
Very interesting. And so, wrapping up now, I want to talk about why doing research on communities like this, like African descendants in Latin America, why it's important. By looking at issues of the past like slavery and racial injustice, we can better understand how systemic racism has affected and continues to affect our country, and how it may differ in other countries like Mexico, which I think is super interesting. And by examining the push and pull factors regarding migration, especially of African Americans to Mexico, we can look for alternative perspectives on similar issues that face our society today. And lastly, documenting ethnic and cultural groups like African descendants in Latin America can help us become more aware of these groups and bring their voices to the forefront, as they're not as touched upon by popular history. And I think that stuff is important.
Very much.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to end it here. Thanks for listening.
Bye.